until he left in '84. After Mountie worked for 3 aerospace organizations in Southern California. Bob's currently employed at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He's also one of our very good volunteers up here, does a lot for the museum. He grew up in Miami Township, attending and graduating Carlisle Public Schools. His family's home was about 2 miles from the Chautauqua Park, and he often visited in the 50s and 60s, and that is the topic of tonight's presentation, the village of Chautauqua. Bob?
Thanks, Jack. Actually, I'm going to have a disclaimer up front. Because so many of you probably have background in Chautauqua, I decided I'd start at the beginning, give you a lot of details when nobody's alive to dispute me. And as we get closer in timeline, I'll get less and less detail so you can fill it in. But there's still quite a few images that we're going to cover. And I want to give you really what the roots are of Chautauqua Movement, as well as Miami Valley Chautauqua, things that probably, even though you people were aware of what was going on, you never really, you can't hear microphone. Microphone there? Okay. I'll get that way.
That's good.
That's better. So we're up.
Lights? Can we
Yeah. Thank you. How's that? Okay. All right. So let's get started. Have the next slide, please. See what we got here. That's a little map of where Chautauqua is, in case you don't know. It's kind of on the in between Miamisburg and Franklin, on the banks of the Great Miami River. That's the Miami Valley Chautauqua that we all know. It actually started 5 years before that in the west side of the city of Franklin. But I'm going to start at the very beginning. It is not in Franklin, Ohio, but in Chautauqua, New York. So next slide, please. Chautauqua is actually a county in far western corner of New York, right there. And it began in 1874 as a religious assembly and retreat for Protestant denomination, and specifically the Methodists. Got the next slide, please. The founders of the Institute and what became known as Chautauqua Movement were the Reverend John Vincent, who later became a bishop of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which has merged over this last century or so as United Methodist Church, and Lewis Miller. Miller was an inventor and industrialist out of Akron, Ohio. He was also a very devout Christian and educator. Particularly, he was superintendent of Sunday schools in the Methodist Church. And these men got together and said, well, they were developing a Sunday school program for education, and they said there really wasn't a good way to do that, and that they would start a place where they would take candidates out in the country for a couple of weeks of Bible training and religious training to get personal experiences, that the Sunday school teachers could then be much more effective in educating the young and the adults. So next slide, please. So this is Lake Chautauqua. It's a long lake, one of maybe the smallest of the Finger Lakes, but it's an Iroquois word, and the translation, if you go to Wikipedia, is something like where the fish are taken out or jumping fish water. Has something to do with lakes and fish. And there's a Chautauqua Institute is at a little spot called Fairport, and that's where they set it up. And it was a 2-week program in New York. Now there's a couple small towns down at both ends, but it was connected pretty well by rail, so people could ultimately get there. And using Miller's money, they started building things. So I have the next view graph, next slide. They actually built a replica of Palestine. And so this is an example, this is a scale model, so that they would take their students through and point out where the locations were in the Dead Sea and all of that. But that was only the first couple years. As they continued, the program evolved. And what they started doing was having guest speakers, actually revivals, the old-fashioned camp meetings, but also all kinds of entertainment to keep people going. And it became to the middle class and upper middle class in the late 1800s, a destination. People were interested. There wasn't a lot of formal education, and so this served a need and became immensely popular. The next slide, please. And there were 4 pillars of the Chautauqua Association. One was religion. It was definitely very much religion. It was 2, education, and that's self-education. They would actually have a publishing company. They would send out things. They would have speakers in all fields, including science and history and culture. They do cultural art. There would be painting classes and sculpture and also recreation. You know, so this concept, healthy body, healthy mind, and it all wrapped up in that program. And that within a couple of decades, there were well over 100 informal Chautauqua imitation, loosely bound together, following the principles but not necessarily tied. And so there would be at a local town. This is actually a postcard of a tent meeting place in Richmond, Indiana, and dated in the early 1900s. This is the Red Path Traveling Chautauqua. They would actually use a train, travel from town to town, set up, hold a couple of days of services and education, and move on. So these were all around the United States. They really, by 1910 or so, there were over 104 local Chautauquas, but again, a dozen or more of these traveling ones. And there were several in Ohio, but we're going to focus for the rest of the talk on the Miami Valley one, where it started and all of this. So can I have the next? I'm going to tell just a couple. So Lake Chautauqua was on the lake, so there was a boat. People would take trains and come here, and it was a large institute. And they had an 8,000-foot amphitheater that would be filled to capacity for people to go. And so the smaller ones would copy this and emulate it. This was still the mother organization, but all of them took that as a guidance of how they were going to do things. Next slide, please. So this gets us to the founding of the Miami Valley Chautauqua. And the person who really started the first one was a Methodist minister in Germantown, Ohio. His name is Elihu Enso Harper. Apparently, he always went by EA, which I think is a good reason, but that's virtually unpronounceable, at least to me, name. But he was a relatively young man, and in 1896, he organized a well-known speaker to come to the west side of Franklin. They had a fairground here. It was called the Miami Valley Fairgrounds. It was not the county fairground. That was in Lebanon, but Franklin, because of its location close to the train, had a fairground which was really based on horse racing. But they got a big circus tent, and then so that people to stay. So by the next slide, this is a map of where that. This is from an 1891 map of Franklin Township. So this is downtown Franklin here. This is the suspension bridge. That's before the lions that we now know. But the lions were there holding up the supports. But here was this fairgrounds racetrack. Right out here, you'll see there's a rail line here and a rail line here. And of course, the interurban ran along the east bank of the Great Miami River, so there was a lot of opportunity for transportation. So they had the first one in 1896 and for just 2 weeks, and then they decided, well, we'll have another one. So I have the next one. So this is the location to the fairground. A horse. I don't know, it looks like it might be a racing horse, trotter, but those are the entrance. And then they would use a couple of the buildings for a cafeteria, but they would use the big tent for the meeting location. And so it started in summer of 1896, kind of the next one. So again, this is the suspension bridge across the Great Miami River with the lions. If you, just as an aside, if you go to across the Lions Bridge now, you face the lions. They're watching you. But when they put up the bridge in 1874, the lions were watching the bridge. So so no one would take it, but I suppose. But this is a city map with the bridge, and here's the Chautauqua. That's the grandstand. So people would sit here, but and then they would pitch tents. They would get tents that people would stay in, rent the tents, and then they would go and do the entertainment. But they had not only religious service, they were doing what they did in the Chautauqua, that is, have famous speakers. And the first person one of the first people they had, next slide, was Major General John B. Gordon, Confederate States of America. He was the featured speaker. This was just 30 years after the end of the Civil War. Many of the men were veterans. The Grand Army of the Republic was a huge national, and this was a very articulate man. He gave us the last days of Confederacy. He was with Lee when Lee surrendered. In the last days, and one was the last days of Confederacy, and then the other was the first days of Confederacy. And so there were huge crowds that came to see that. And that now. Reverend Harper had 2 years of that and decided that he was going to go back and be a minister. He ultimately ended up being a law professor at Ohio Northern. So I guess he did, but he decided that organizing Chautauquas was too demanding a job. It was very popular, but there wasn't a lot of money made. So a group of Franklin businessmen said, okay, this was started, we'll form it as our Christian duty to have the Chautauquas. They formed initially for profit, but ultimately not for profit corporation. And they started having the next Chautauquas in that location. So next slide. This is that big tent, a circus tent, and people were milling about. This was about 1888 or 1889. So you can see them wandering around and either listening for somebody or waiting for the next event. Have next slide. In 1897, another speaker they had. This was actually from their program. This is Bishop John Vincent, the originator of Chautauqua, came and spoke at the Miami Valley Chautauqua. And so he was here. Again, this is a map of the railroads that you can get to Franklin. So from Cincinnati, there were people coming, all the way up from Toledo, Indianapolis, all could get there relatively quickly with modern rail. And they sent out these brochures, and it was a very successful operation, even though it was always touch and go, but they were doing well. Next slide. In 1898, they appointed the Franklin High School principal, superintendent, F. Gillum Cromer, to be the general president. And so he ran it for almost 20 years. And the story is that he is one very demanding Christian, and his rules were the Sabbath will be honored, and you don't do anything but the holy things. And this ended up being, I think, a difficulty for some people, but overall, they did pretty well, and he was important in making a decision in a couple of years about what would be the fate of the Miami Valley Chautauqua. Next slide. Here in 1898, this is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was, as you know, the champion of Negro rights. They had also a native-born bishop of the Methodist Church named Thurkill, who was an educator and famous for running universities, founding and running universities for black education. And so the topics were very much about civil rights at the time, women's right, and of course prohibition. These were Protestants. They were very much against prohibition, and of course one of the most famous speakers to come was William Jennings Bryan. He ran 4 times for president. He apparently was a spellbinder speaker, and he came 4 different times to Miami Valley Chautauqua. The first time was in 1899. But now the program would run, instead of just being like 5 days of religious and then another week or so of speakers, they would have almost over 2 weeks going. And they'd have musicians and actors and novelty acts. So I have the next slide. So this is a speaker. I mean, it could be Billy Sunday. I don't know if many of you know, but in the beginning of the 20th century, Billy Sunday was the Billy Graham of that part of there. I mean, he had a huge, he was a baseball star, found religion, and spent the rest of his life converting people. And so when he gave dynamic sermon / lectures, and so but this is in that tent at the Miami Valley Chautauqua right around 1900. Okay, next please. Here's an example. These are the Tuxedo Ladies Band and Orchestra from Cincinnati. You see women all in their fancy clothes, and they had animal trainers and magicians and local talent. The men quartet out of the Franklin Methodist Church sang once or twice. They had a woman who was apparently a very good whistler, and so she was part of the show. So they had diverse entertainment for people. They'd pay their quarter, and so there wasn't a lot of options. You know, no radio, no TV, no recordings. So this was the way that people would come. They would, you know, camp out and enjoy themselves for a couple weeks. So this was going on, but they were getting crowds too large to handle in that part of ground this west of Franklin, and so the board of directors said, if we're going to continue, we need a better location. So I have the next slide. And so after the 1900 assembly, they purchased a piece of land on what was the Vanderveer farm just north of the hydraulic dam north of Franklin, about a mile north of Franklin. It's 123, there's a bridge now that goes across. That used to be 123 and about half a mile. And there was another partial land south of Franklin, between Franklin and Middletown, that was also in contention, but there was more land, more potential, and maybe connections, who knows. I mean, people doing religion and business were always the same, whoever that. But they purchased the land in 1900, and by July 20, 1901, this assembly hall, this is an open-air assembly hall, was built, and they had 200 tents laid out along the river. And so the Miami Valley Chautauqua on the shores of the Great Miami River was underway. So that next one. Here's the layout of land. Here's Franklin. The X is where the original, for the first 5 years, Miami Valley Chautauqua was. Here's Carlisle. Again, there's an interchange here. And this is down Franklin. Here's Miamisburg. So, you know, mountains right about over in here somewhere for those. And this was all farmland just there at Chautauqua. They bought this piece of land and set up shop. And that's where they, next slide. This is a modern picture of that. You can see the dam was here. This is kind of a bend in the river. This is actually, you know, when this is modern, but when the hydraulic dam, the river was actually up 5 to 10 feet higher, and so it covered more. So this was the broadest part of the Miami River. It had, you know, natural road. There were hills on the east side, lots of trees, and here's Chautauqua Road, and the interurban ran right across here. So they worked the powers that be and said, you know, it'd be nice to have a footbridge and people could stop on the interurban, which is local and come across. So that's what happened in the year. Next slide. So this is here. This is a natural growth. This was basically just farmland. They built the auditorium. They put in a store. They put in a couple other buildings. This is where they had a boat dock. They also had lots, and they started selling lots in the association where people could put summer homes. The rules were, the way it was set, you couldn't really live there, but you could build a summer home there. And people started buying the lots, essentially on a part of the association. So they were a private community. And so they bought this acre originally, then they bought another extension of land. So these were lots that over the next 50 to 70 years were built. But all this was away from the rest of the road. The road that runs across Chautauqua Road's down here. But there's the Great Miami, and this, to get the trees that they wanted here, they're on the left bank, or about right in there, right past the bend, is Crane's Run. Cranes Run is a narrow road with lots. They actually went down to 4,000 trees, I think. Dug them up, planted them along there to do that as part of the recovery. So they had lots of natural trees, and that's what they did in order to provide the grove, the shade for the campers and the recreation. Next slide. That was the bridge I'm talking about. So this bridge went across. There's the piers. This was an interurban. It was always a footbridge. It was never for vehicles. I mean, I'm sure there was a guy or two who took a bicycle across but there wasn't any, motor. I don't know if anybody tried to run a horse across there or not. I never saw a record of it, and this is the Chautauqua. This is, right here, not only is it the interurban, it's also what became State Route 25. The Miami Area Canal was still here, and also the rail line, when it started, ran here. So there were 4 means of transportation on the East Bank. Just there. Now the interurban would stop here, but the trains that would go by, they'd stop in Franklin or Miamisburg. You could either switch to an interurban, or you could, be a person with a cab or a wagon that could drive you out if you were going to go by taking that road. There were bridges at Franklin and another bridge in Miamisburg, get you across to the west side. Okay, next please. In 1909, they got a post office, and you'll see Chautauqua Post Office, a summer post office. So people could mail things directly from Chautauqua and receive them while they're there. So it was a branch that was only open in the summer, but again, there was also, a Bureau of Information, the laundry office, everything was multitask, but, and so this was relatively close to the bridge, so presumably they could haul mail to and from the interurban that would connect. Okay, next please. On the west side, or north side, this is into the campground. This is their stone pedestal. That would be the entrance into the gateway of the official park. And so you would walk in here and you kind of see a hint of tents that were set up. These were, relatively large tents, but still, mostly for families or joint families to rent. Okay, next please. This is Tent City. This is, maybe around 1910. From an old postcard. A lot of these are postcards. I personally collect postcards and been looking around for them on Chautauqua and some of them are on websites and so forth. You can see the people out roughing it, but it wasn't so rough compared to what they lived like at home. Now, in the hot summer, you had no air conditioning anywhere. Here you were by the river, and then there was the river and so forth. So that would be all, and you had a view. You had a nice view. Next, please. And of course, a promenade with the tents. You're out in your best, showing off your stuff as you walk around. So that was apparently part of the leisure that people would do. Next, please. They did have groceries and provisions that would be brought in, so you could get those necessities. They had a dining room. People could get their meals. Everything had a little price, but you could get what you needed. Come here, or you could do picnic baskets and so forth. Okay, next please. And of course the big thing was the Great Miami River. This is, there was swimming, diving, and this is the Miami Queen, a little steamboat. Run up and down, and this was before the Hutchings Dam was built, and just below that, downstream, is a hydraulic dam, so the water was up. So you couldn't go downstream, but you could go up along that curvature for a bit. And there were also, canoes and rowboats that you could do. Next, please. Here's a group of them landing, all in their, nice clothes. A few people back in the by the docks where they could swim. That would be, you can see the rail line back there in the interurban. This is all in the East Bank. See the electric lines? I assume they're electric. Next, please. And of course, there would be music. This is a morning concert under the trees. There's some people sitting out playing, so there'd be music in the afternoon. There'd be all kinds of a variety. Next. And of course, if you didn't want to do much of anything, you could sit on the beach and watch the people that jumped in the water and so forth, and gossip or whatever you did with no face for fun. But So, I mean, it was popular and was going quite well. Next. Here's their program. They had 18 days of recreation and instruction. That, they never forgot that education part. They were going to instruct a religious part. They would have religious services. That's pretty much the same picture we saw there. There's the streetcars coming in, more people hanging out, and they had lines that you could connect to, special discount rate, to get people there, and so they were into advertising. Next, please. And of course, people started doing their little cottages. Now these are not like the cottages at Newport in Rhode Island or the ones that are, but they're not little shacks particularly either. So that's where, but they were not meant, at least not in the organizer mind, to be permanent homes. They were meant to be summer cabins used in the summer for a vacation you could do there. But that it wasn't really meant to be an all year round residence. But they laid those down on those blocks and so forth. So there's probably still a few buildings, I don't know, that probably been renovated a lot that still exists there. Next, please. A lot of that changed in 1913. Now nobody was at the camp because it was March and there wasn't anybody there. But there was a lot of water. And this is in Franklin. This is the suspension bridge right there, and it's just up there. Well, the east side didn't flood too much, but the west side flooded for 4 miles across, all the way down because the river bend there, and it flooded all the way. So next slide. I hope it kind of shows in red. We shaded it. So here's the riverbed, this kind of snake-like thing that goes along like that. And between the high banks on either side, where there's a kind of a shade, all that was underwater. It varied from a few feet, even a couple feet, up to 12 or 14 feet. And for Chautauqua, it took out the docks, it took out lots of stuff. However, there was a high spot where they had built a hotel for, a little higher scale for people that wanted to tenant those that were willing to pay a couple of dollars more. And that was the Bellevue Hotel and dining room. And it was the only structure that didn't get underwater at all. And next slide. You can see this building. It was kind of the highest ground around. It was a little knoll, but it was it accidentally burned down in 1929. They were remodeling it, and a torch set on fire and it burned down. They built a new hotel almost immediately after. But anyway, it was a real challenge in 1913. They couldn't have the season. It took out the interurban bridge. The only bridge standing between, even above Dayton and Cincinnati, was the Franklin Bridge. Railroad lines were out. So there was no 1913 season. Manager Cromer put together a 1914 season. They repaired stuff, but people were still, and it wasn't very well attended, and they lost a lot of money, and it went into receivership, and they were going to shut it down. Cromer resigned, but a group of businessmen out of Dayton underwrote the loan and restarted. They hired another minister, and actually a minister named, I think the next slide. This shows in 1914 what they did. Here's where the dam was. The bridge was washed out. They put a temporary catwalk across the lower part, so people could get in the interurban service restored. So you go down the steps and you walk across, and could do that. But but they restarted in 16, and it continued, and pretty much over the next 25 years, which we'll cover in more detail, expanded quite a bit. But it did change. But these are people here. But they never rebuilt the streetcar because, for one thing, now roads were getting better, more people were getting automobiles, and it wasn't that kind of transportation. You could still take trains to the towns, but you wouldn't necessarily want to do the interurban. Okay, next, and I think this is Reverend Shower, who ran the Chautauqua for almost 15 years, and he continued the tradition, but also started making more changes in the infrastructure of how it was being done. But it still remained pretty much as a Chautauqua. That is, revivals, lectures, groups, but not so much entertainment value. And next, please. But they were a big draw. It was, you know, artistic entertainers. This is from a 1922 program. Phil Callahan sent me this a couple weeks ago. It shows, you know, a little orchestra. So they have the same type of programs in the 20s that they had earlier. They had rebuilt the auditorium. The auditorium was a open-ended auditorium. It was, that is, it wasn't a closed-in building, but it was meant for summers. So we got ventilation, and you had a stage. But next, please. Again, Billy Sunday came back. He drew people, you know, tremendously, and it's kind of one of his photographs showing him about leaning over the pedestal, and I guess it was, you know, really exciting when he had. It said 6,000 people were on the ground, and they were selling out of ice cream and pop. Everybody was having, you know, a big time, and everybody. And it says here, picnickers spread out their basket lunch everywhere on the ground until it rained. I mean, that is a problem when you're outside picnicking, and you know, but anyway, it was. But you know, we're looking now, 28, 29, 30. There's a change coming. A depression is hitting. That's kind of altering, and radio's there. People now can turn on, you know, the radio. They can get entertainment there. They don't have to travel somewhere and camp out. So, and religious sentiment was, if not gone away, was slowing down. There's not much enthusiasm. So there were some differences. Again, there were some funding problems. Go ahead, next slide. See where we are. And what they did is they hired a Middletown principal, Wade Miller, who for almost 20 years guided the Chautauqua through this period. One of the first things they did is, before Chautauqua was really closed in, that is, you came to the assemblies or you bought a summer residence. What they did in 28, 29 is they opened the grounds in the summer from Decoration Day, Memorial Day, Decoration Day, up until Labor Day. So it was free entrance to there. Now, I mean, if you wanted to do any of the activities, there was a price. But you could come in, you could picnic, you could do. And they also started adding more amenities. Next, please. One of the first things they did is they built an Olympic-sized swimming pool. This swimming pool, you know, it was unheard of in this part of Ohio. I mean, and they took, you know, those that were around a couple months ago heard about the aquifer and how much great water we have here. There's lots of water. It's really cold, but there's lots of water. They didn't take any chances. They put in a boiler, and they heated the water up and warmed up the water into the pool. So it was a big success. But that wasn't the only thing they did. There's a building here that eventually became a skating rink. It wasn't in 1929, but it was in the 30s that they had a skating rink. Next, please. And so this was that free admission as a summer resort. So it became not just a Chautauqua retreat, Chautauqua, but more as a resort. When the Bellevue Hotel, they replaced it with a larger Grandview Hotel. They added a new coffee shop, a dining hall, shelter houses for picnics and reunions. And to quote one thing, it was completely screened against insects. And they also started building cabin row, that is, small cabins along where they used to have tents, so that people could now rent something a little more substantial. And in 1935, as a WPA project, water and sewer lines from Franklin were added. Now it took a couple of 3 years, but when that was done, now they had flushable toilets, they got bathrooms, and no more outhouses. So again, it became much more attractive to spend your vacation in Chautauqua. And also, by the late 30s, they were offering discounts for conferences. So more and more conferences, whether they're social organization, religious conferences, would come for a long weekend, a week, and they would book things and they had programs. So Chautauqua became more diversified. But again, there were, next please. There were still, they modernized the auditorium. They got bench seats from the Cincinnati Street Rail Company, put those in. They made a more modern looking stage, pedestal stage. They have bands, performances in Chautauqua. Next. That's the rebuilt hotel, the Grand View. It actually overlooks the swimming pool. I don't know if that's the next slide or a later one. Yeah. So here it is. There's a swimming pool. That's the Grand View Hotel. So if you stayed in a hotel, you were almost by the pool. And next, please. They added things like tennis, basketball courts, baseball diamonds. Throughout next 32, they added stables put down there. And they said visitors like renting horses. Residents weren't so happy. Horses kind of smell bad, and horses leave a lot of horse manure in your yards and so forth. So while visitors enjoyed them, the residents were less than enraptured by the fact that there were horses available. But again, for people that would come, they were attracting people from all over the area. And there were lots of families. Hi.
That's my house.
We have somebody here that still lives in that house.
You still live in that house?
That was the manager's house.
Oh.
That was the only full-time house.
So you live there, huh?
I live there now.
Oh, you live there now? Still smelling horses or not? Or are they long gone?
I used to have horses. But the horses were stabled in the community center.
That's right. They turned it in, what, 60s, I think, or 50s?
But that was the first full year. Somebody lived in that house full year. It had a
Yeah.
furnace and inside walls.
So, like I said, I really don't want to talk about modern time because there's only too many people who know more than I know. That's very dangerous. That's not how you want to give talks. When your audience knows more than you do. But I think it's great to share the story. I mean, I'm not trying to lecture people about it. I want to share this story of what Chautauqua is because, our generation, the ones before us and after, it's going to disappear. And it was a unique experience in this part of the country. And so, and that's why we started, I'll give a little ad, why Miamisburg History Society and the Carlisle History Society, Franklin History Society started to do this last year, was to document more that we could of that before it really disappears. I mean, of what's going on. So we started that, and we actually have made a couple of videos of that. And this one's being recorded. Hopefully it's going to turn out okay. But we wanted to share what Chautauqua was, so these memories just went fade. Maybe our grandkids or great-grandkids might care. Not sure, but maybe.
What street is that now? That guy. What street is that now?
What street is that now?
Franklin.
Franklin Street?
It goes Franklin Hill, then first, second, third.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Next. Oh, and they also added bowling, but this is duck pin bowling. Not the kind of bowling that most of us remember. There's a little bitty duck pins. You roll a little ball. You see there? That was in one building over, and you could 10 cents a game in the afternoon, and I guess it must have been 15 cents a game in the evening and 2 for a quarter. I don't know. I had a hard time with the regular bowling myself, but anyway. Next. But the big addition that was in the very late 30s was a skating rink. This was, high-end skating rink, big. They had an organ, played music, just like looks like the big cities. And all through the 40s and 50s, that skating rink was very popular. So there's a little more story. I don't think it's right away, but I'll tell you what happened there. Next, please. Now, remember we started saying Cabin Road? These are those little, what used to be tents. They originally put tents along this. This is the main drag that would go along to the north side up to the river. And they replaced what were tents with small cabins. You know, I think they could be a large cabin that, you know, may have several beds, and then they were smaller cabins. They were basically sleeping places. They're not really rooms, but they start putting more of those in. Next, please. And that's what it looks like in the wintertime. You know, everything bottled up, there, snow, nobody around. You know, probably only photographers don't want to walk out there and want to look at that. But
look at that sign. Bicycles keep out.
Bicycle keep out. Yeah, yeah. You walk. You weren't supposed to. Next, please. They also, to encourage, built shelter houses. And remember I said here, they got screens in there. Now you can have picnics, family reunions, get together, and they would rent them for a day or for a weekend, or you know, people would go. They had, you know, picnic tables. So and it became multi-generational. You know, some families for generations would come to Chautauqua and meet. So next, please. In 1937, they actually had cottages, a directory, and there were 133 cottages, and there were still 150 vacant lots in 1937. That was at the very end of the Depression still. I mean, the Depression was still there. But I know you can't read it, but almost all the cabins, the owners would give them names, like Friendship Inn, Welcome Kit, Tumble Inn, Sunset, Time Outlook, Nonsuch, Fairview. I was talking to a person yesterday who said that she knew a person that in the 30s had a house called swastika. And, you know, swastika is an old symbol. When the Nazi came to power, they changed the name of their house. But, you know, people had all kinds of names, and I know there are people that have a sign of a house or two. There's still around, but so you didn't go by an address. You would presumably tell somebody you were the such and such house, and they would know that. Okay, next please. Now, they hadn't run out of doing evangelistic things, and they started offering. I brought up another Methodist. In case you didn't read it early on, I'm the Franklin Methodist historian. I'm the historian for the Franklin Methodist Church and was involved. So I once in a while sneak in a little Methodist guy. But he was the pastor of the Franklin Church there. But he actually retired from active being a pastor and became an evangelist. And he moved back to Franklin. And he would travel with the, rather than being a local. But he was opening 1905 Miami Valley Bible Conference on Chautauqua ground and made president. And then he organized a conference in '34. Now this was during the height of the Depression, but you know they were again Bible study group. You know, a one-day or a few-day retreat. Had Billy Sunday again, but Mrs. Maud Bellingham Booth, she was one of the founders of Salvation Army. I mean, these were, you know, Dr. Bob Jones was another famous evangelist speaker. So they would come, and people that lived in the area could do that. I have a personal story to relate. 1934, my mother was a high school girl. She was going to she went to one of those, and she said, you know, it really changed her life. Of course, she met my father later, and that changed her life even more. But that's a different story. You know, they still were doing that, but it was getting more of a struggle. There weren't people going to do that. So they were doing more, becoming a resort. Next, please. But they did have, this is Eleanor Roosevelt spoke on July 14, 1940. This was, she had a national, in the national papers, a column every day she'd write. She wrote about this and her experience. She was very impressed by the Chautauqua people and so forth. And that encouraged a lot more people to come and visit. And she never came back, but she, you know, did that one time. And many of the people that think about it say, well, it's maybe the epitome of what the movement of Chautauqua was in the Miami Valley, was that visit. And again, the organization was trying to get more people to come consistently to support the park. There were also more people starting to reside full-time in Chautauqua. So they were modifying their houses to winterize them. So it was gradually changing. Next slide. This was a coffee shop. You know, there's teenagers, young adults, kids all hanging out. These were popular in the next, please. Again, all that's by the fact that there was a dam here. This is a hydraulic dam, not a, you know, it had nothing to do with the Miami Area Canal. This fed water into the paper mills down in Franklin. The other factories would use the water. But this actually goes back to about 1864, 1865. But what it did is made all this river back up, and so it could be used. That little lumpy thing there, that's the pedestal from where the footbridge used to be. That's an interurban, so that had to be around, right around or right before 1940, because the interurbans quit running then between Middletown and Dayton. So, next please. One of the things they did was try to do broadcast shows from Chautauqua, and the radio station in this part of the country was WLW. You recall it's clear channel station we heard almost all across the country. And Peter Grant was a well-known personality. This was before he became Ruth Lyon's sidekick, by the way. Those of you who are a little older remember Ruth Lyon in the 50s and 60s. Peter Grant was her straight man, but he was a respected, you know, radio columnist, reporter, and he and they would have like quiz kids and a few other shows. They were popular. Chautauqua got there, but the radio station didn't make very much money, and so World War II came up. You know, that with rationing gasoline and there wasn't a lot of programs that they could do. So the town, or you know, kind of settled into the war. Well, local families would come for a getaway because they could do that, but you know, larger crowds traveling didn't happen. But the war ended next. In 1946, it was the 50th anniversary of the founding of Chautauqua, Miami Valley Chautauqua in 1896. And so what they wanted to do was have a big 3-day celebration. And so they started on a Friday, July 26th, and they ran through Saturday. And they had a variety of programs. And the organizer for almost all those activities was Clarence Asplenider. And Sharon's back there watching me, so his daughter. And so, you know, next slide. Here's Clarence directing their choir. It's Chautauqua Memories. They had skits, programs, and one evening, 50th anniversary. Next, please. They also had the Harmonaires. This is a radio group that broadcast. They performed live and broadcast on Sunday to conclude the activity. But the president of the Miami Valley Association, who was the last surviving member, last board member from the original organization, named Seymour Tibbles, next, wrote a book, Chautauqua Then and Now, where he outlined the history from his perspective, from the very beginning, the people that were involved, and that's actually available, the content's available online. Our History Society has a couple of hard copies of the book, and maybe others, but if you're interested in knowing a lot of the details, I'd be happy to email you the text so you can see that, because it seems a pretty straightforward account. It's certainly written in the view of the early 19th century and or early 20th century, in early 1900s perspective. But Mr. Tibbles was the publisher of the Franklin Chronicle for several decades, and so he was a newspaper man, and he lived just a couple more years. But he was the last board member of the original board member, and then there was some other people coming in, and also he started changing other measures. Next, please. After the war, they decided they were going to upscale the resort park. So they had miniature golf. They had miniature golf in the 30s. I think they started in the late 30s, but they added that. So they had miniature golf, coffee shop. Next, please. Now they had kitty land. You know, kitties were a big thing in the 40s and 50s. There was a baby boom, and so you know, they put in the boats and the little cars and swings and teeter-totters and they, you know, safe play. And I remember being on a couple of those, and I bet there's other of you out here my age or a little older or a little younger who still do. But next, please. There was this train that ran around, little steam train, and you know, you could go around that area. That was until you got too big to ride it, then you couldn't go anymore. So, but you know, there's one of the shelter houses, I think. Next, please. And then for the more mature, there's shuffleboard, you know, to do. Okay. But there still was religion. There were a nature chapel. This is down very close to where the dam is, and there would be church conferences and retreats and Sunday school classes. But the multi-day assembly retreat, they were pretty much gone. They were now being replaced by the other types of activities. And so, again, Chautauqua was trying to adapt to a new mode. Next, please. Oh, blank slide. Let's hopefully there's something after that. But again, the river still stayed, you know, a big drawing card. The water was still up. So next. Speedboats came. Of course, you had speedboats, you can't have much else on the river because they'll run over top of you. The little Island Queen deteriorated. Some of them just tell me they remember playing on it before it kind of sunk. But again, there's other small boats. And next, please. There was another flood. This was the flood of 1959. It wasn't as devastating in 1913, unless, of course, this is the skating rink. And that hardwood floor, it didn't survive. The water covered the swimming pool, and I was told that when the water went down, there were a lot of dead and not so well fish in the swimming pool they had to get rid of. But it was decided that even though the skating rink was too far gone, they first converted it into a 10-lane duck pin, and then ultimately into a regular bowling alley. And it's still a bowling alley. It's still being used as a bowling alley at Camp Chautauqua now, which is, you know, 55 years or so since then. So upgraded. I think they have automatic pin setters and so forth, but it's still a bowling alley. Next, please. So here it is in the 60s with people bowling and doing stuff. And again, this was open to people in the area. You could go and use the facility, pay the fee, whether you went to swimming pool. I never went bowling, but I did go to the swimming pool quite a bit when I could do that. So I certainly remember that. And you could walk the park playgrounds for free. Find a girl to walk with you. You could walk along the shore and talk nice to her. But anyway, next, please. But by the 30s, there was a change where people wanted to stay. We told you they were starting to build the cabins. So there were smaller cabins that you could rent, where like a few beds for a family. There was also larger cabins where, you know, a group could stay. You know, where they have a Boy Scout troop or a class or extended family that would rent for, you know, something on the order. This was around early 1950s. There was the Grandview Hotel that could do up to 150 people. And there was a Francis Willard. Francis Willard, that was a WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union. In the 1920s, they were given permission to build their meeting facilities on the Chautauqua ground, and they used that for that. but they also had a place for single ladies that could stay overnight and rent rooms. And so it is still on the ground. It hasn't been remodeled yet. The people who run Camp Chautauqua would like to get it fixed up and use it for something else because it's right off the main part of the ground. But it was available to rent. And then there was a new kind of rental, and it's called a cab hotel. And the next slide. These are open in '52, and they said they were a combination of hotel and cabin. Again, that Clarence Aspelnider, who was chairman of the Miami Valley Chautauqua Association at the time, supposedly named that. But it was an all modern, had electric kitchen, and a couple of the things said Frigidaire, but he worked at Frigidaire, so they had Frigidaire appliances. They had Davenport. Yes.
We're fortunate to have his daughter here tonight.
Yes.
Sharon Aspelnider.
Yes, she is. Where she's hiding. She might probably embarrassed her. There she is.
Sharon. Yeah, right there. Clarence's daughter, Sharon.
So, the next slide actually shows a picture. There were 4 of these buildings at the court, the Capitol Court. So you have 4 of these. They now use them. The buildings are still standing. They now interconnect them, and they use them at the Camp Chautauqua for their kind of high-end guests to stay. But there are doors that you can go in between so you can partition them and so forth. They don't use the kitchen area. They had little heaters. They didn't have air conditioning because people didn't have air conditioning in the 50s much. You sat outside in the porch, I guess, and waited until it got dark enough. But then you're on the river, so often you would get some cooling breeze, I guess. So, next, please. Through the 50s and 60s, Chautauqua kept trying to, get more revenue and host more things. So, they tried a professional summer theater in 1958. 1 year it didn't work, but they had AAU swim meets. A number of them. This is the program. The Dayton Dolphins. If you're a long-time person, remember Dayton Dolphins was there. They have a swim meet and diving. Remember, Chautauqua had an Olympic-sized swimming pool when almost nobody else did. I mean, that was quite an event. University of Dayton had football camp. For a few years, Miami University held like a pre-college preparation clinics where people would go for a couple of weeks to get prepared for college. On the action side, they had power speedboat racing on the river and on Labor Day and water skiing. Well, they kept running high-speed boats on the river so much that the people who lived on the bank started complaining, saying that the wakes were knocking down their land, and finally they were banned. So they couldn't do it. But they literally were getting to their garages, I guess. So, next, please. And Chautauqua continued to have the general programs and reunions, but Steve Lake, a Franklin businessman and musician, organized a country western show, one show in 1965 at the auditorium. And he had the Grand Ole Opry. This is Steve's original sign, photograph of his original sign, pointing the way to Chautauqua to see his show with Ernest Tubb and the Texas Troubadours. It cost you, he had 2 shows and it cost you $1.50 back in 1965. So, but it was so successful that for the next year he booked a season. Every Sunday afternoon and evening they would have country, western, and bluegrass singers. Next, please. This is a 1967 program. I know you can't read all this, but it has like Hank Williams Jr. and Jerry Lee Lewis and Bill Anderson and Loretta Lynn and Porter Wagner. And toward the end, they had that little Dolly Parton show up once. So, but they had the singers that would come, and but still, even though these were popular and the people that lived in Chautauqua, they were the people residents that ran the association were being assessed more and more money to keep things going. They were a private organization. They didn't have other money coming in, and the park wasn't bringing in a lot of money. And So in 1968, I say I'm not sure what I got coming up next. Can you show me? Not much of anything. We'll stay here for a minute because.
I think that's me.
You think that's you?
Yeah, I was a newspaper carrier, and that's my bag on me.
Wow.
I remember the guy taking the picture.
Do you? Wow. See, like I said, it's very dangerous talking to an audience in modern times, which is why I'm fading fast now. Because then people know a lot more than I know. But, so, in the early 60s, the Baptist Association of Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio started having their youth retreats down in Chautauqua. And in 1966, 65, the folks that Chautauqua Association owed money to pushed them to foreclose and liquidate. So, and they couldn't, the residents couldn't raise enough money to pay off the debt. So they put it up to bid. So there were two bids, two offers. One is the Baptist Association offered $115,000, which would have covered the debt. Steve Lake said that he would offer $135,000 and continue as a resort and show. Now there was a lot of discussion and disagreement, but ultimately it was decided by a very close vote, like, you know, I don't remember exactly, 65, 62 or something, because there were only a few people who voted to accept the offer from the Baptist Church. At least part of the explanation was the Baptist Association were following the description that the original Chautauqua did, that is education, religion primarily, and said they would do other things. And so it was accepted, and so the Baptists took over in 1969. Steve Lake gave performances 68, 69. Starting in 69, someone who's never been identified started setting fires on the park land. The first thing to burn was the original auditorium. And so that ended any kind of entertainment in the auditorium. In 71, Steve Lake had a bluegrass performance up at the Montgomery County Fairgrounds, but he went on for his entertainment. But the people at the Baptist Church built another one, that's what this one is, and but they also set fire to the shelter houses and to the grocery store. So almost all the old buildings were, the Grandview Hotel was set on fire twice, but never burned down, but it was essentially derelict. And in the late 60s it was torn down, but the Baptists used it there at, in the next slide, hope you're not in one of these pictures, but we'll see. Maybe. But it was now called Camp Chautauqua, and as a camp that was a church camp. They would have congregation groups come in all summer long to use the park. Now the townspeople, the residents, they still lived in their own private association, but they no longer had access to the park property because it belonged to the Baptist Church. So, but the program continued. In about 1975, Jerry Harmeyer came, took over, and he ran it for over 35 years. And I'm not showing that because we did a walking tour, a video tour with Jerry last summer, and we showed it. It was on TV, and we have a DVD of it. We're working on putting it out that people could to get it, or we're going to show it places. Because Jerry walked you through comparing what Camp Chautauqua is now versus what it was before he got it and how they made the changes. So rather than for me to try to take 45 minutes to do all that, since I've already run almost an hour, and I know nobody wants to stay indefinitely to watch these things, I'm not going to follow that up. But it is there. They are still doing, Jerry retired, and the Baptist Church gave up the mission about 3 years ago, I guess now. His son Jason is running it as a not-for-profit corporation. They've got donors. They rebuilt, they expanded the auditorium. It's now enclosed with basketball courts, and they can accommodate by jam-packing people in all these buildings. It used to be restaurants and so forth, up to 800 people in a weekend, you know, per night, and they have all kinds of sports activity. The pool's still up and running, although I guess they don't heat it anymore. It was too expensive to buy gas, so you got to be a tougher soul. But you know, they do the youth-orientated activities with religious and recreation, team building, that's the sort of thing that. So. You know, it is still a Chautauqua tradition being continued, a little differently than what it was. It's more, I think, more non-denominational now than what it was the previous 30 years, but it's still there. Next, please. That's an example of the shelter house that was burned. The shelter houses, what they did in the Jerry and so forth, is essentially rebuilt them into dormitories. The chimney and so forth, which were there, they left. They took it down to concrete and rebuilt them, and now they use them as sleeping quarters. And they have stuff. So they have a large dining room and lots of enthusiastic people. Next, please. This is sort of the last piece, and I'm pretty sure the people in back can't read it. So this is what Phil Callahan sent to me a couple, 3 weeks ago. And if you look at the picture, it has to be no later than the early 20s. It might even be earlier than that. And the title is At Chautauqua. The maidens are the fairest at Chautauqua. The summer days are rarest at Chautauqua. Friendship is the strongest. Love light glows the longest as we battle against the wrongest at Chautauqua. Life's burden seem the highest at Chautauqua. The campfires burn the brightest at Chautauqua. Plain girls are the fewest, maidens' eyes the bluest, their little hearts are truest at Chautauqua. The sun shines ever brightest at Chautauqua. The breezes whisper lightest at Chautauqua. Gatekeepers are the keenest, the river ain't the cleanest, and the mosquitoes are the meanest at Chautauqua. Okay. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that most of that still remains pretty true. Okay, and I think I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this trip back. I mean, I'll take questions, but there may be other people who can answer a lot better than I can. Yes, Lou.
Question. First of all, I managed a swimming pool there in the summer of '66. And one of my lifeguards at that pool is sitting here. The question I wanted to ask is, please, anyone who skated in the skating ring, hold up your hand. How many people actually skated in the skating ring?
Look back there.
Okay.
You got to look like close to 20. Yeah. I never liked skates. I kept falling down. So. Anybody else? Yes.
Was that an urban line that ran on the east side of the river? Was that the what they call the Red Devil?
No, it was a different one. It's similar though, but it was the Cincinnati. Had different names, but the Red Devil were a slightly different one, I think. Yeah. But it was in the same interurban that it started in Cincinnati and would go up to Dayton. But they were originally in smaller sections, and then they kind of merged, and it went all the way up to Toledo on that line. So. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.